Good morning, everybody. It's my great pleasure to introduce Eric Attias, who is joining us today from San Diego, but he is in Hawaii at first. Eric got his bachelor's degree at the Rupin Academic Institute in Israel in marine sciences. He then went to Southampton, where he got a master's and then a PhD, working with Tim Minchell. Since then, he has had an appointment at the University of Hawaii, first as a postdoctoral scholar and now as a researcher and affiliate faculty. Eric has broad interests in marine geophysics and oceanography, and he's an expert in using electromagnetic methods for imaging and for constraining processes that reach from solid earth dynamics to ocean dynamics and I guess biological processes. He's going to talk to us today about some of his interests, and his presentation is on studying complex earth processes associated with geohazards and resources. Let's welcome Eric.
Thank you, Thorsten. Thank you for this introduction, and thank you all for joining this seminar today. As Thorsten mentioned, my talk today will focus on a variety of structure, processes, and domains that most of them are linked to geohazard and resources, and how we can image them and describe them using different types of marine electromagnetic system. I want to start by stating some of the current global challenges that we're facing. Volcanic hazard, for sure. This is an image I took from Hawaii in the eruption in 2018. Water crisis, according to prediction, by 2050, half of the world countries will suffer from shortage of water, and the need for minerals that will be, the demand will double by 2050. Now, all those three are sit under the umbrella of humanitarian geophysics, which topics such as geohazard, climate change, and freshwater, the need for fresh water, and the inevitable shift from hydrocarbons to renewable energy is our responsibility as a scientist and as a society as a whole to deal with in our current time. And that to basically make a more sustainable or keep our sustainable human environment. And therefore, that is essentially my overarching theme of my research. I interested in studying dynamic processes that you can divide them to natural either resources or hazard. And this is some of the project or all of the projects I've done in the past, ongoing research, and the future research project that I'm planning to work on. And of course, that's a lot, so I'm not going to discuss all of them today. I'm just going to discuss the ones that you see in the box. So I'll start with some study that I've done related to gas hydrate offshore of Norway. Next, I'm going to talk about submarine freshwater in Hawaii. That's my recent work. Moving to my ongoing research, which is monitoring CO2 storage offshore of Norway. Then moving to near future research project, which is continental breakup in the Mediterranean Sea. Then back to resources and study the lithosphere biosphere hydrology system in the Galapagos island. I'm going to talk about seafloor minerals, future project in Central India region, and finish off with the gas hydrogen association project in Antarctic Peninsula, which is already being funded, and it's scheduled to go on 2024, going for the cruise. So this is pretty much the scoop of the talk. But before I start, I want to thank all and acknowledge all my collaborators that I've been collaborating with in the past, currently, and in the future. And they're from all over the world. You have team from Southampton and people from the US, of course, that you all know of, but also from Malaysia, Germany, and so on. So I'll start with this brief introduction to marine electromagnetic methods. So the marine EM methods, as we call them, they rely on imaging or solving for the bulk electrical resistivity using the properties of looking at both the rock matrix and the pore fluid. And that methods are sensitive to three things: porosity, temperature, and volatile. And the EM methods, unlike the seismic, are based on diffusion equation. So we are sensing something, diffusive field. And we divide those two methods, the main one that we're using, into passive and active. The passive is magnetotelluric method, which we are relying on a natural source of magnetotelluric due to solar winds that basically interacts with the Earth magnetic field. And then by that, going through the subsurface, and we record the returning secondary fields with our seafloor instruments. The active source, which we call control source EM, CSEM for short, we use a transmitter that is attached to the ship, and we drag that transmitter about 50 to 100 meters above the seafloor. We induce current, so that creates electromagnetic field that we interact with the subsurface, create magnetic fields, and then the secondary fields are also recording by this electric field receivers. How the physics of it works? So we basically relying on the decoupled of Maxwell equations, and by Faraday law, when you run a magnet through a coil, it induces an electric field. Ampere's law, once you induce some energy source around an iron bar, you get a magnetic field that in turn creates an electric field. So taking those two together, we have basically what the MT method is relying on. Solar winds creates variation in Earth EM field. That in turn creates an electric currents, which is our plane wave source, which is unknown, but we can measure it with our seafloor receiver. The energy source for the CSEM method comes from our transmitter, as you shown before. We induce on a dipole, interact with the subsurface, and record it. Now, the physical property that we're solving for is basically the conductivity, the electrical conductivity, which is the inverse of electrical resistivity. And the electrical resistivity is basically the physical property that you will see later on in all of the figures that I will show you today in my EM inversion models. Now, the EM methods are relying on the fact, taking the advantage that the Earth material electrical resistivity varies over 5 orders of magnitude. So for example, if you look at water, we can distinguish between seawater and fresh water based on their resistivity or conductivity values. Or sediments, marine and land sediments, we can also distinguish between those two, and we distinguish between sediments with seawater or sediment that that basically accommodates hydrates, which have a higher resistivity value. Now, all of this domain or geological structure, they kind of spread out in Earth in a wide depth range. Therefore, we use a scoop of marine EM system that helps us image from the upper mantle all the way to the surface. We start with the empty nodal-based CSEM. This is the system you already explained before. So the EM receiver first can record the empty signal, which is good roughly to the upper mantle, around 200 kilometers, depending how much sediment we have in the shallow structure. And that is relatively simple. We deploy, we wait, and we until we get the periods that we want from the instruments, and then we recover the instrument back. But that same receiver, and it's unlike land EM, also record CSEM basically fields while we go with the transmitter over those receivers. And that gives us a good resolution because we're inducing current and we're not relying on a source that we are unknown of, and gives us a good resolution throughout the crust. Now, the CSEM method can be slightly improved when we take that concept and we use a towed array. So we continuously toting an array of receivers, we call them the Vulcans, in evenly spaced to about a kilometer or even more. And that basically collects a dense data set. And that gives us a higher resolution because we collect dense and also in higher frequency of the information about the seafloor, under the seafloor to about the kilometer. And that's very efficient in terms of vessel-wise because we can scan larger area because we're not relying on the positioning of the seafloor. The same logic, there is a system that was developed in 2015 for image permafrost in Alaska that we call continuously surface towed array, which called the purposes. And that was the same concept. We basically towed an array, but on the surface, and we get the navigation information from a GPS. That system is limited to about 100 meters of water, but it gives us a really nice and high resolution to 500 meters beneath the seafloor, which the kind of thumb rule is half of the depth from the source receiver array. So here is a kilometer, so we can get good resolution to about 500 meters. And we can operate that from a small vessel. And this is an example or images of some of the instruments I've used in the past. You can see that most of them belong to scripts, but there are other groups which are have instruments in the academic world. It's the Southampton institution, the National Oceanography Center, GeoMar in Germany, and BGR in Germany. And most of these instruments, they're not commercially available. That's something that is important to mention. But the Scripps EM Lab, which is probably the biggest in the world, makes their instruments and technology available for collaborators. So we now have an entire system for the image from the upper mantle all the way to the surface, various processes and structure. And this is some example of the geological domain that we can use EM methods to describe. Their importance and which method that will be suitable for that. So we start with large, deeper areas, lithosphere stratigraphy boundary, which is important to understand plate motion and metal dynamics. Subduction zone, relevant to earthquakes. Spreading zone, upwelling dynamics. Going to shallower areas, submarine water, which is a resource and also important for biochemical cycles. Submarine leakage and monitoring, which is the inevitable shift to move from hydrocarbon to climate change. We have to consider that aspect. Seafloor minerals as well. That's the shift that I was talking before, sorry. And gas hydro reservoir, which are relevant for climate change, submarine landslide, and potential resource. So before I'm going to show you all the results and imaging of the figures and inversion results of different projects, I want to share something that is common to all the stuff that you're going to see later. It's the workflow. Once we collect the data, we got to go through that workflow that it's lengthy to get our results. So we start by using this system that I showed you before, which is relatively cutting-edge technology that wasn't existed 10 years ago, and those different systems of marine electromagnetic methods. Then once we have the data, we have to go through a robust EM processing to convert our information from a time domain to the frequency domain using a fast Fourier transform. We have to have a good navigation and process that accurately because EM methods are sensitive to inaccuracies in navigation. Once we have that, we merge them together to go to the next step, which is the finite element inversion modeling scheme. So we built our data file, and then we have to send it to a cluster because it's computationally expensive to do those inversions and to get our results. The next step is to do an integrated interpretation, get all the other data, as all of you are doing, obviously in your research, that we can, in order to have a real overall holistic kind of understanding of the structure or the process that we're aiming for. And the end goal is to describe better or describe a new system, process, or structure inner. So this is relevant to all of the slides I'm going to show next. And I'm going to start with my past and present research project. First thing is gas hydrate. This is an example from a gas hydrate chimney that is offshore of Norway. And what you see here is basically an unconstrained 2D CSEM inversion, which means controlled source, where all the colors are the EM information. And from throughout the talk, bear in mind that blue colors are resistive and yellow to reddish colors are conductive. And you can see the range here, it's fairly small. It's from about half ohmmeter to 3 ohmmeter. And this is overlay or correlated on a seismic reflection data. And you can see over here where the chimney is, the CNO3, you have a strong resistor correlated with the blanking zone from the existence of gas hydrate. And you can also see that there is some resistor above the gas hydrate stability zone that we are not sure if it's an artifact or hydrates, because it's a diffusive method and therefore we see some smearing. And the resistor below, it's most likely free gas. So we can take this render that we already confirmed we have a chimney here. And now we can constrain the CSEM inversion with both seismic constraints of velocity and reflection. And that substantially sharpens our understanding of the pipe or the chimney, which is the gas hydrate. And you can see that it also removed, sorry, go one back. It removed all the what was suspected as an artifact that are indeed artifact, and the gas hydrate is mostly focused on the chimney. Doing some quantification of that, we use Archie's law, and we basically determined that there is 38% of saturation of hydrate in that chimney. Remember this number because I'm going to refer to it later on, that we quantified the hydrates in a different method. Now we can take both of the information from the seafloor receiver, which what I showed you in the previous slides, but we can also incorporate the volcan information. Now the volcan information gives you a high resolution, not only because of the dense data, but because it also has a vertical component, which the seafloor receiver doesn't have. And what you see here on the right, it's basically the combined inversion of their both, and you can have a sense of that chimney here in the center. It's much more focused, and we can get a higher resolution that is comparable to the one inversion that we constrained with seismic. And we confirmed that that is really a chimney by getting some core sample from that region, and we find some hydrates in that region. So, okay, we described it sort of by the two information of the seismic and the CSEM inversion, as you see here. But to move from more rigorous approach from qualitative to quantitative, we have to use some rock physics information. So as you saw, we have the co-rendering of the CSEM inversion with the seismic, then we structurally constrain that. The last slide was the inversion of both of them together. And now to have a rigorous integrated interpretation moving from qualitative to quantitative, we need to take those seismic attributes and the inversion of the CSEM attribute and link them together through a rock physics model. That's what we have done next. We used what we call a three-phase joint elastic and electrical self-consistent approximation and differentiate effective medium modeling, which is basically calculating all the physical properties of the elastic and the electrical under the same microstructure. So we have no assumptions. We built up our component all together and derive the physical properties of each inclusion in that mix. So here it will be clay, quartz, hydrate, and seawater. And the physics of that, and it's pretty complex, you can see in the paper by Anne et al., and that we followed and had extended that work. And once we have that, we get that image on the right here, which is basically a search table we have for each porosity, velocity, and resistivity value. We can derive the saturation of gas hydrate. So the next step, we take our remote sensing data, which is the seismic, the VP, and the CSEM, which we took from the chimney that you saw earlier, and we basically overlay them on that search table. And that gives us, for each one of the resistivity and velocity values, it gives us the saturation level. And here we have three different layers because we have three different velocities throughout the chimney. But basically, from the core data, we saw that the range of porosities varies from about 55% to 65%, with a mean value of 60%. So by having that, we estimated that the hydrate saturation is 30% in that particular poke mark, which is lower than what the Archie's estimation was calculation, because Archie's use some empirical constant that are not well constrained. So that's a more rigorous way of quantifying marine gas hydrate deposit, and that will help us to deal with issues that are correlated with gas hydrate, the greenhouse gas emissions, the relative to the seafloor slope stability, and the potential as an energy resource. The next project I'm going to talk about is my recent work in Hawaii, where we use that surface toad, as you see here, CSEM, to map submarine freshwater offshore the Big Island. So before I go to Hawaii, I want to show this nice image from just a paper that just came out recently. And that's the offshore fresh groundwater distribution globally and the water demand. So the bluish color is the distribution. The warmer colors are the water demand along the coastline. So that paper discussed only non-renewable resources that were deposited during the last glacial maximum period, where the mean sea level was substantially lower. But it doesn't account for renewable resources, which may be found in volcanic islands. So let's see what we have in Hawaii, for instance. So in Hawaii, I joined the EKY project, with EKY means the knowledge of water in Hawaiian. That was an NSF 5-year project, and I joined only on year 3. And when I joined, by the time I joined, they realized that to quantify the aquifer system in a Walalai volcano, this is what they started with. They realized that there is a groundwater discrepancy between what the recharge is in the top of the volcano to what is measured by the coastline. And that was substantial, about 40%. So we then decided to think about where all this water are going to. The basic assumption was based on the USGS conventional hydrogeologic models that are used in Hawaii and other volcanic islands since the 1940s, and then it was extended by Oki's work in the 90s. Basically, they all assume that fresh water are released only at the coastline as spring submarine groundwater discharge, as you can see here. But beneath them, there is some brackish water layer, what you see in the pink, and beneath that there is only salt water. So there is no submarine or any groundwater, fresh water that go into the oceanic environment. And when I saw this 40%, I was sort of, my scientific intuition told me that's not the full story. So I wrote a proposal to see if that's truly the only transport mechanism of fresh water from the land to the ocean. And for that, we use what we saw previously, is the surface toad porpoise system. In that particular survey, we use the dipole. You can see we have a short antenna and a long antenna, which is a dipole of 40 meter long. And we injected about, 100 amp of current. And that current translates to an EM field, interact with the groundwater, and then we record with the porpoise array the secondary field, which is about 1 kilometer. And at the end of it, we have a dorsal unit, which also records the altitude, the conductivity, and temperature of the water. So this is some of the parameters of our survey. You can see all the lines here in black, which encompass the entire offshore area that is parallel to the study area of that project. So the land information, there was multiple scientists, we were 30 scientists working on that project in different disciplines, but there was very sparse data from all over that region. While with the marine data, we could cover the entire region in one survey, collected 5 different data sets from a range of 150 meters from the coastline to about 4.5 kilometers. So we got about 220 kilometers of data in only 8 days of survey. So that's pretty substantial amount of data. And this is what our end result. I'm jumping to the inversion model directly. And I'm gonna explain a bit about what you see here. So those are 22 discretized inversion model. And what you see in the top layer, this is basically basalt that is saturated by seawater. So red is seawater. The bluish color is where you're starting to get more fresh and brackish water. And the strong blue color is highly resistive, which is probably dominated by purely fresh water. And the reason is that there is a lot of freshwater influx from lava tubes, which is basically just a channel of clean fresh water. But the nice thing I wanted to notice here, you can see the nice kind of tied in between all the survey lines, that you can see a conductive layer of seawater in the basalt, and then you have a freshwater, sort of fresh and water layer, which is the fresh, kind of fresh or brackish, then another conductive layer, secondary layer, and then another fresh layer. And you can see how well the cross line and the inlines are tied up together by cross line 1 and cross line 2. And I want to show you one example in more detail, which is the line that we acquired here in the north side. So this is line 3B north, and you can see the seafloor topography, and then that basalt with seawater. In 150 meters, we get a resistive layer, then a conductive layer of seawater, and then another resistive layer. And you can see that we fed the data to an RMS misfit of 1. This is the responses of 3 hertz of our information, the amplitude and phase, which is what are recording. And that was pretty much, this is an example, but it was consistent throughout the entire of our model. So we took that regional information and we developed a new conceptual model of freshwater, what we call multilayer transport mechanism. And this is a short video that kind of explains the process. The aquifer is filled from rainwater, percolates down through the basalt, and then you find those porous basalts that you can infiltrate into those channels, and then start making the wave slope down into the ocean. So now you're going to ask, why is it separated and not mixing up? The reason for that is because there is low permeability layers of confined layers, which are a mixture of ash and soil that are eroded between volcanic eruption periods. And therefore, they act as seals. And then some of the water released as spring, and you get in those regions intrusion of seawater. So that was our new conceptual model. So what I've shown you before, it's imaging with CSEM, everything that is below the seafloor, so the submarine and the subsurface. But in that study, we also discovered, it was not known before, that you can actually image freshwater plumes in the water column using the CSEM imaging. And this is an example of 2 lines that I'm showing you here. So you can see that the dashed line is the seafloor. And those resistive layers basically south groundwater discharging from an areas when there is fractures within the basalt. They find a way and they escape from the seafloor all the way to the surface. And you can see also those resistive layers at the top, which is possibly seeps of freshwater, buoyant freshwater from nearby seeps that kind of propagated into the area that we measured, took the data from. So that's a really nice kind of results that we got. because normally in the EM world, we don't invert for the water column data because it's highly computationally expensive. But in order to feed this, the subsurface data, I realized that I need to invert for the water, and also because I was diving a lot in that area and I realized that I'm always sensing fresh water. So the assumption that we have horizontal fixed layers of conductivity in the water column doesn't apply in this region. So based on that, we updated our model to kind of describe the hydraulic system in Hawaii, which is probably the governing mechanism in other volcanic islands, because there is land evidence for that. And we discovered that we have significant volume of freshwater deposit and those large scale freshwater plumes. And that is a valuable renewable resource for volcanic island as a whole. And it's also very important for coastal biochemical cycles, because those freshwater plumes brings a lot of nutrients and carbons into the water and a colder temperature, so that can change the biodiversity and the growth of algae and corals in that region. And there is already companies. This is, for instance, a French company. It's called Marine Tech, that already developed a technology to harvest those fresh water. They contact me asking about the research, and I contact them with the water supply in Hawaii. So now they're in touch. Maybe they will harvest those waters. Next project I'm going to show you is about CO2 storage. That's a collaborative work, a EU project that is use different types of sensors to kind of monitor CO2 leakage from a specific pork mark offshore of Norway, which is next to the Shell prospect proposed CCS site that they're planning to inject CO2 into. So the motivation to that was to reduce carbon emission by 80 to 95% by 2015, which is according to the Paris Agreement. And the goal of this project was to validate those storage sites by monitoring them. So in this study, other geotechnical modelers did some different scenarios to evaluate the saturation of CO2 when you injected for 2 weeks, as you can see here, from a 500-meter depth. And based on that, to see the propagation and how the saturation will look like for a different time scale, 5 years, 15, 25 years. So what we did that in that study that we collected data, we took that data as a first step and ran different types of scenarios for CSEM modeling and in different time scale. So if we have an injection in that layer of 500 meter, about 50% of CO2, how, and then the according saturation around that pork mark, what we can resolve. And you can see here, when we seismically constrain the basement, we can see a nice kind of representation of the true model that we inserted. And now we're working on the inversion of the real data. So that shows you that we can actually monitor CO2 leakages using a CSEM, and here we only use 6 seafloor receiver. And that promotes basically the development of CCS technologies. And it's important because if it will be done in the future, it has to be monitored and regulated based on the agreement. So that's an important tool that we can use to monitor CO2 leakages. I'm going to follow up now with the future that proposals or research plans that I have, which are in the writing proposal stage. So I'm going to start with this project that is related to breakup mechanism. So you all know the system in the Afar triple junction, with the rifting is kind of induced by an inactive vertical plume that disintegrate the inherited weakness at the top and spread that rift. But what happened when you have a more complex system, which is composed of a plate boundary convergence system rifting and subduction zone in the same area. Such a place exists in the Sicilian Channel Reef Zone, as you can see here in the blue, that area, which is basically situated between the African and the Eurasia plate boundary that are converging, and the Calabrian arc, which subducting. So you have a rift in between two plates that are converging and next to a subduction zone. And the Sicily Channel is kind of characterized by a network of faults, fracture, interplate, and subduction volcanism. And it has frequent seismicity with a history of more than a magnitude above 7 that initiated earthquakes and tsunamis. And the Calabrian arc is characterized by a slab rollback that creates a toroidal mantle flow. Now, it's important to notice that deep processes in that region, that interaction, are poorly constrained because there is not much data in the marine environment. Therefore, we plan such a project, and the importance of that there is an abundance of communication cables and pipelines in that region that are shared by these 4 countries, and therefore it has impact or both environmental, social, and economical impacts in general. That's why it's important to study that region. And there are some geodynamic models over that region that kind of image or describe the Calabrian subduction zone, the slab rollback. But as you can see here in this model, that channel, there is not much information, or there's no geodynamic model for that area. So we know that the slab rollback creates toroidal mantle flow that in turn interact with the channel. Now, what is important to understand, or what we wish to understand, is how this interaction dynamics affects that entire region. So what's the nature of that interaction? And how is it associated to important questions such as this rift evolution? Is it an active or passive rift area? Is the toroidal flow effects or linked to the volcanism in the shallow area and associated earthquakes? And if we do have a solid continental breakup in this area, are we looking at the new microplate within the Sicily channel? So in a way, that region, it's an ideal place to study such complex tectonic processes that involve a few different mechanisms. Next project that I want to show you, it's about the Galapagos Islands, which over there we want to study the interplay between the mantle plume, freshwater, and biodiversity. And it's important to know that freshwater in Galapagos it's a critical resource because they have limited pumping wells, and some of them they show high contamination from basically the sewages systems. There is some previous information on this region about the mantle plume. You can see here from the low shear wave velocity, which those 2 areas, A and B, you can see they're crossing just above the Isabella Island in this region. So we roughly know where the mantle plume is rising in this area. But there is not much information how it behaves in the shallow area. So what we know that if that mechanism that works of the freshwater in the Galapagos, there is some land evidence for that. If the same mechanism works as the one we saw in Hawaii, we want to know what is the mantle plume effect on that submarine freshwater preferential flow and nutrient and carbon fluxes. So to do that, we have to describe the mantle plume at first. And that we can do with the combination of LandMT, the seafloor receivers, and CSEM with the system that is shown before. Now, if that logic applies, that we do have this transport mechanism, it means that we'll also expect to have some freshwater plume as we saw in Hawaii. And that leads to the question, how did that affect biochemical cycles in that region? which is mostly the contribution of nutrient and carbon fluxes. And that we can examine with the AUV of Southampton that we're planning to use, which has a lab-on-chip sensor that will give us all the variables of nutrients and carbon in the water column. That will help us explain if the rich biodiversity in the Galapagos is because of the contributions of freshwater nutrients from that kind of channeling. And we are aiming to describe it in multiple ways, start with the fundamental for the microbiome, and then to primary production, coral, fish, and potentially to mammals. And the approach we're going to take is to use environmental DNA sensor that Southampton developed. So it will give us the DNA sequencing and an RNA gene expression of the entire invertebrate, so we can distinguish between plume areas and non-plume areas. And we're going to also do habitat mapping using an ROV and collect sample with the Southampton ROV. So what you see here is basically an example of an interdisciplinary research that what I'm most interested in, that you will incorporate geophysics with geochemistry, marine biology, and molecular genetics to understand a system as a whole across the lithosphere, biosphere interface. Another project that we're now in the scaffolding stage is to map seafloor minerals in a hydrothermal vent that was recently discovered in the central Indian region. You can see a nice bathymetry of that region. And I think we can all agree by now, or the governments agree, that to stop climate from progression, we have to deal with, there is going to be an inevitable shift from fossil fuels to renewable energy. And the World Bank estimates that such a shift will basically increase the mineral production by 500% by 2050 in order to meet the growing demand for this type of technologies. The good news is that seafloor minerals are electrically conductive, so we can use EM methods to image them. And here we're going to take a slightly different approach. It's more a novel thing that Constable developed in 2018 with collaborative from the industry with Ocean Shore Geophysics when they inverted the roles. So now we have the CSEM seafloor units as transmitters, so you can deploy them in a 3D grid, and then making an AUV with electrodes on it as a receiver. So you can go through and have a 3D grid of mineral system, which is fairly shallow. And with the other data sets of the AUV, we can now map and characterize fully seafloor mineral fields. And that is kind of contributing to the shift that needs to be done from hydrocarbon to green energy revolution. And this is the last one I'm gonna describe. And that is a project that is already been funded, and the cruise is scheduled to January 2024, which is a large-scale project with 20 scientists from Spain, the UK, Germany, Norway, Italy, and I'm part of the Hawai'i USA group. And the motivation for that project is to deal with the increase of temperature, or understand the temperature rise in the southern hemisphere that rapidly changed by 3 degrees since the 1951. So we aim to understand the impact of ice sheet retreat and how it affects with tectonic control on gas hydrate fluids dynamic on the Antarctic Peninsula. And we know already that gas hydrate are dissociating in this region due to pressure and temperature conditions. And here we're going to use, from the EM kind of perspective, the combination of both seafloor and that volcan array that you saw from before to image those gas hydrate and combine them with other data sets, multi-channel seismic, CTD, and gravity multi-core to kind of understand that fluid, the gas hydrodynamics in that region. That was my near future and tangible project, which we're in the process of working on. But what do I see for the future as a vision of how is this field is going to move toward. So as you already understand, I'm interested to study the upper mantle to shallow lithosphere complex and structure processes, which are normally described with the spatio-temporal variations. And for example, one of the projects that I'm working on, and I didn't show you here, is what's the role of hydrates, formation or dissociation, when it combines with freshwater influx, how it can promote or mitigate the behavior of sleep blocking or sleeping. So if hydro dissociates and you have a combination of freshwater influx with that kind of effect subducted of the incoming plate, and that, for example, we are aiming for to study in the Peru-Chile subduction zone. And the way to approach that, as I see, is to use, besides MT, to look at the deeper lithospheric structure, is to use AUV and EM fleet when you have electrodes and you have multiple AUV that you can change on the fly, and each is in the same dive, both the tone line configuration, inline and cross line, and the offset. So that will give you in a one survey the full scope of the entire region from deep to shallow. Now, such a kind of array or system will generate a large amount of data, which we can deal with in some extent with the usual deterministic or stochastic inversion model that we use normally today. But I believe that in the near future, in order to expand on that system, we'll have to take it to the world of deep learning, and assuming, as you have in the tech center, you have large-scale HPC, and that is completely doable to do. So this is how I envision the world is going through in terms of EM. We're going to have an independent system with adjustable settings. And I'm going to finish by showing some potential collaboration that I see and hope to foster at your center from a variety of topics, as you've seen before. And this is just an example of names that I think that will be a great potential of collaboration. A variety of topics from submarine freshwater to sea floor minerals, to more hazard kind of thing, a subduction zone or fracture faults mechanism, and to mantle plume dynamics. So it's a variety of topics that EM can resolve. And that's pretty much it. Thank you for attending and listening.
Thanks a lot, Eric. That was an impressive array of projects. My head is spinning.
Sorry.
Presentation. We have time for questions. I'm going to try to monitor here.
Yeah, we'll exit the sharing.
Yeah. So if you could raise your hand.
There's one in the chat, Thorsten.
Yes, okay. Right, so the question in the chat is, can you use fiber optic cables as a detector, right? So would it be feasible to assess subsurface resistivity and so on using voltage variations in fiber optic cables? So I guess using the fiber as an antenna.
No, not as a sensor, but we do use fiber optics. For example, the Southampton system works on fiber optics, and the fiber optic gives you two advantages. A, you can design a system that can be much more extensive, longer, and you can go deeper, and you can give you the ability to get a stream of the data as you go along. While the normal coax system that Scripps uses at the moment, you cannot stream the data upward. We only see the data afterwards, but we have some information on the navigation. So that will be the biggest advantage of fiber optic, is to get the data streamed online while you're dragging or towing the array.
Thanks. So we got two hands up here. Kewa, please.
Thanks for the interesting talk. So I'm wondering, can your method be applied to sediments with mixtures of free gas and hydrate? Because in the venting system, it's usually a mixture of hydrate and free gas, and also in many of the reservoirs, it might also be true. So can your method be used to differentiate the free gas and hydrate?
That's a good question, and no, this is why the seismic is very important. We can differentiate it while we integrate it with the seismic, but normally they coexist, the gas hydrate and the free gas, and it's hard with the EM method to detect what is it. So one thing to understand about the EM, that it doesn't tell you what the subsurface is. It just tell you the electrical resistivity. It's got to be in the context of the geology and other information. That's why we always strive to incorporate other data sets.
Thank you.
Duncan.
Hey, yeah, fascinating talk. I was wondering, for the Hawaii groundwater example, is there any LGN overprint on that system, or how long does that system take to re-equilibrate?
Sorry, can you repeat that? I didn't understand.
For the Hawaii example, is there any signal of the sea level change related to the LGN on that system?
Yeah, it does. No, I don't think it changes the sea level. But we know it's continuous dynamic process. The water are always fluxing, and particularly where we've shown. So one of the model I show you, there is a big blob of resistivity in that region, and it's continuous. And this is where there's a large lava tubes in that area that we also saw them on the shore, and we also know them from borehole. So you know that it's kind of a continuous dynamic system and therefore renewable, but it's not certain how it affects in terms of sea level rise and other factor. It's still relatively new, and we study that.
Okay, thank you.
I don't see any hands right now. Are there other questions? So Eric, I was wondering, in terms of the workflow that you presented, where do you see your expertise being sort of the most impactful? And from what I understand, sort of you're sort of doing everything, right? You've led the expeditions and you worked on the inversion, but in particular, sort of where do you see yourself most contributing there?
Well, I see myself in the bridge of everything. So I'm not focusing in only one method, although my expertise in EM or on one specific geologic domain. I'm interested in important question, using whatever skill set I had to kind of answer those challenging questions. So it goes from resources to geohazard as you saw. I would say my strength is my ocean experience from before the academic, understanding of instruments, holistic understanding of the ocean environment and in Earth in general, and how to link between fields. So I can link between genetics and geophysics in a way, and use the tools, use the algorithms and the inversion schemes that others developed, and wave the channel between all of those different kind of interfaces to come up with an answer to specific questions that we have.
In terms of the inversions, one of the things that sort of struck me talking to Rob Evans quite a while ago now was that there's still real challenges in doing these nonlinear inversions in 3 dimensions. And I wonder what your perspective there is, because at least at the time, I remember saying that Rob was telling me that industry has way more capacity and capabilities there, both in terms of the algorithms and in terms of the compute resources. And I wonder where we stand there right now in terms of doing full 3D inversions. And is this something that you think we should be pushing for in the academic community, or where do you see sort of the ties with industrial imaging there?
Well, I'm not worried about that because we're just to the verge of having it academically. The industry has it. For instance, EMGS They have the codes and also CGG. But there are developing within the academic system. You're right, there is still some challenges, particularly when you're doing amphibious studies across the ocean and continental, with the empty codes, for instance, to describe it in 3D. But I think there soon is going to be available academic ones to model CSEM. There is always, you can follow papers, there is always different algorithms suggested. Kerry is working on 3D code, and the Geomar groups as well. So we're just about to be there in terms of that capability, and that will strengthen our ability to kind of describe those systems.
Thanks. We have a question from Minnow.
Yes, so we've been looking at some reflections from the water column.
Yeah.
And there are some beautiful reflections. So I was just wondering if you try to look into that in the Hawaiian data set, because this density variations basically create impedance contrasts. And even we have done some, with Zayu and I, we've even done some FWI on that data set. Mm-hmm. So you can actually see a lot of different beautiful features that are often ignored, because primarily interest is in the subsurface below water.
Yeah,
so,
absolutely.
Do you have any seismic data set there that you can?
No, so that's the thing. Okay. I was struggling to find seismic data in that region, but it's fairly close to the shore. There isn't any seismic data of the seafloor because I think seismologists are reluctant to go to that region because there's barely any sediments. It's mostly basalt, and it's pretty challenging for seismic in that region. So therefore, I couldn't find any.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you.
If we don't have any more questions, I don't see any more hands up, then let's thank Eric again for a great presentation. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much. See you all. And thank you all for hosting me and discussing.
And we'll see you in a bit. And Eric is around for a couple more meetings this afternoon, so let's hope we can figure the Zoom out.